Welcome, esteemed viewers, to a dark historical chapter where holy faith drowned in a vast ocean of crimson ruins.
In the year 1095, a single papal decree ignited a holy fire across the dark lands of Europe.
Tens of thousands bravely marched eastward with grand crosses on their chests, desperately seeking salvation and the sacred city. But the road to paradise was paved with the bones of the innocent, driven by unyielding and absolute human greed. How did a divine mission of peace transform into the darkest tragedy the medieval world had ever witnessed? According to ancient chronicles, the Grand Council of Clermont marked the spectacular beginning of this unprecedented war. Pope Urban II stood before a massive crowd, his voice echoing with divine authority and unyielding holy wrath. He painted a terrifying picture of the eastern lands, claiming that magnificent sacred sites were being defiled daily. With a golden cross raised high, the pontiff promised absolute and eternal forgiveness for all past earthly sins. Whoever took up the sword for Christ would be guaranteed a direct and gloriously magnificent path to eternal heaven. The massive crowd erupted in religious ecstasy, crying out, "God wills it!" as they pledged their fragile lives to the cause. It was a rare moment of unity for a continent heavily fractured by endless feudal wars and devastating starvation. The ultimate promise of spiritual salvation was incredibly intoxicating to both the mighty nobles and the impoverished. Thousands of common peasants sewed crude red crosses onto their torn garments, leaving their generational farms behind forever. They were led by charismatic preachers, deeply believing their pure devotion was vastly stronger than any steel armor. Meanwhile, wealthy feudal lords heavily mortgaged their vast ancestral lands to rapidly fund this massive campaign. Gleaming knights in polished chainmail assembled under the blinding sun, radiating a sense of absolute righteousness. They truly believed they were the chosen instruments of divine will, marching valiantly to liberate the holy city. As the massive armies began their long journey, the atmosphere was completely filled with holy hymns and loud, echoing prayers. The glorious white surcoats bearing the vibrant red cross became a universal and undeniable symbol of Christian duty. However, modern historians argue that this blinding wave of holy faith masked a deeply terrifying and grim reality. The religious fervor quickly evolved into a dangerous mass hysteria that completely swept across entire medieval towns. Families were torn apart as men blindly abandoned their weeping wives and children for the distant, unknown eastern deserts. The mighty church had successfully weaponized faith, transforming peaceful believers into a terrifying and relentless holy militia. Many illiterate peasants marched without weapons, completely trusting that heavenly angels would ultimately fight beside them. They envisioned Jerusalem as a literal paradise on earth, endlessly flowing with eternal rivers of milk and sweet honey. For the younger noble sons without inheritance, the East offered a golden and unprecedented chance to claim their own kingdoms. Thus, the Noble Crusade was born, from a highly volatile and explosive mixture of pure devotion and desperate human ambition. The European landscape slowly disappeared behind them as they bravely stepped into the vast, unforgiving, and unknown territories. As they crossed the dangerous mountain passes, the harsh reality of their monumental journey began to violently strike them. Freezing winter winds and severe food shortages quickly tested the fragile boundaries of their seemingly unbreakable resolve. The holy light that guided them out of Clermont was soon heavily overshadowed by the dark, looming clouds of human nature. The great pilgrimage was about to shed its innocent disguise, completely revealing the monstrous and terrifying beast lurking within. As the Crusader armies marched through the Rhineland, the terrifying reality of their holy mission spectacularly emerged. Starving and undisciplined, the peasant forces began to view local populations as their immediate and most dangerous enemies. According to Jewish historical records, the very first tragedy unfolded not in the distant holy lands of the Golden East. Fired by anti-Semitic hatred and sheer unyielding greed, Crusaders brutally attacked peaceful and defenseless Jewish communities. Innocent civilians perished without mercy in the ancient streets. their vast wealth stolen to fully fund the relentless holy march. The pristine white cloaks of the faithful were forever stained with the dark crimson stains of their own defenseless neighbors. If you were starving on a supposedly holy journey, would you fiercely justify taking from the innocent merely to survive? The noble lords did little to stop the horrific tragedies, secretly and selfishly pocketing the stolen gold for themselves. When the battered armies finally reached the magnificent Byzantine capital, diplomatic relations quickly and completely broke down. The Eastern Christian emperor was utterly horrified by the barbaric and unwashed hordes aggressively arriving at his golden gates. He had requested highly professional mercenaries, but instead received a highly volatile and incredibly destructive religious mob. Tension wildly escalated as Crusaders looted the wealthy Byzantine suburbs, violently attacking the very people they came to aid. The powerful feudal lords demanded total independence, completely refusing to return any conquered eastern lands to the emperor. Crossing into the harsh Anatolian deserts, the holy warriors faced scorching heat and relentless, terrifying enemy ambushes. Thirst and disease severely decimated their ranks, quickly turning noble knights into desperate, savage beasts of pure survival. The shiny armor completely rusted under the desert sun, while their divine ideals slowly rotted away in the unbearable heat. During the brutal and relentless siege of Antioch, the Crusaders resorted to unimaginable acts of cruelty to avoid starvation. Arab chroniclers documented horrific accounts of Western knights consuming the remains of fallen enemy soldiers in the dark. The holy warriors had completely lost their humanity, slowly transforming into the very terrifying demons they swore to destroy. Whenever a massive city fell, the crusading leaders immediately began fiercely fighting each other for the ultimate right to rule it. Bohemond and Raymond, two prominent commanders, nearly destroyed the entire campaign over a petty and bitter territorial dispute. The original solemn vow to liberate Jerusalem was completely forgotten in the face of immense political power and shiny gold. Ordinary soldiers grew heavily and deeply disillusioned, watching their holy leaders behave like incredibly greedy, ruthless warlords. Only the imminent threat of a massive peasant revolt forced the selfish noblemen to reluctantly continue their march to the south. They left behind a devastating and fiery trail of plundered cities, broken promises, and thousands of unfortunate fallen victims. The vast Eastern world watched in absolute horror as the supposedly civilized Christians brought nothing but sheer destruction. The terrifying reality was absolutely undeniable. The cross had become a convenient shield for unrestricted and cruel imperial conquest. Yet the ultimate, devastating tragedy was still waiting for them, rising majestically from the dusty, endless desert horizon ahead. In the scorching heat of summer 1099, the exhausted Crusaders finally stood before the massive walls of Jerusalem. Only a tiny fraction of the original massive army had miraculously survived the grueling and horrific 3-year journey of death. Seeing the holy city, men wept openly and loudly, falling to their battered knees in a state of profound and intense religious awe. They continuously marched barefoot around the heavily fortified walls, chanting sacred hymns to desperately summon a divine miracle. Inside the city, courageous Muslim and Jewish defenders stood shoulder to shoulder, preparing for a desperate, final, and bloody stand. For over a painful month, the Crusaders suffered from severe dehydration under the merciless and absolutely blistering eastern sun. Finally, using massive wooden siege towers entirely covered in wet animal hides, they successfully breached the northern defenses. What immediately followed was not a holy liberation, but the darkest and most devastating tragedy of the entire Middle Ages. The heavily armed knights violently poured into the narrow sandstone streets, unleashing centuries of dark, pent-up holy fury. According to terrified eyewitness accounts, Crusaders violently vanquished all who stood before them, without any shred of mercy. Men, women, and crying children were swept away forever in their homes, in the streets, and deep within the magnificent shrines. The brave defenders who surrendered faced the ultimate judgment, their bodies mercilessly tossed from the high walls into the dusty pits. Many terrified Jewish citizens fled to their main synagogue, only for the Crusaders to barricade the heavy doors and violently burn it. The horrifying, piercing screams of the burning victims were completely drowned out by the victorious and booming Christian war chants. Crimson rivers flowed so heavily through the ancient streets that it violently splashed against the ankles of the massive armored horses. The holy warriors relentlessly waded through terrifying piles of fallen adversaries to finally reach the sacred church of the Holy Sepulchre. With their trembling hands fully stained with ultimate sorrow, they fell to their knees in prayer, loudly thanking God for their victory. It was a deeply disturbing scene of absolute grotesque paradox, perfectly blending pure spiritual devotion with unimaginable human savagery. Does a truly righteous cause ever clearly justify the tragic loss of innocence? Or does it simply mask our darkest, most evil desires? The defeated Muslim governor of Jerusalem solemnly surrendered in the massive Tower of David to desperately save his remaining men. He was one of the very few fortunate souls allowed to leave the burning, destroyed city with his life and a small, heavily armed escort. For the rest of the terrified, defenseless population, there was absolutely no shred of human mercy to be found on that truly dark day. The magnificent and towering Dome of the Rock was completely stripped of its gleaming gold, silver, and precious ancient holy relics. Crusaders proudly and loudly claimed that their crimson-stained victory was a clear and undeniable sign of God's almighty favor. The horrifying, nightmare-inducing news of the tragedy spread incredibly quickly across the entire Islamic and Byzantine world. It cemented a deeply rooted and vicious hatred that would ultimately fuel centuries of increasingly devastating and endless holy wars. Raymond of Toulouse and Godfrey of Bouillon continuously argued bitterly over who would proudly wear the spectacular new golden crown. Even amidst the thousands of fallen tragedies, their endless, insatiable greed and dark ambition remained utterly unsatisfied. The catastrophic First Crusade stands as one of the most profound and deeply disturbing moral paradoxes in all of recorded human history. It successfully and brutally achieved its impossible military goal, but at an incredibly and devastatingly high spiritual cost. The victorious and arrogant Christian lords built their magnificent new kingdoms upon a terrifying and towering mountain of bones. They established 4 heavily fortified and heavily guarded Crusader states to aggressively and violently defend their stolen territories. But the beautiful, elusive dream of a peaceful Christian utopia was entirely and permanently shattered by their own brutal actions. Pope Urban II tragically passed away before the glorious, echoing news of the violent conquest could successfully reach Rome. He never truly knew the horrifying extent of the deeply terrifying nightmares unleashed by his seemingly simple, divine mandate. His powerful religious rhetoric had accidentally created a massive, terrifying monster of completely uncontrollable and dark zeal. The surviving Crusader knights gradually and thoroughly transformed into incredibly wealthy, arrogant rulers of the ancient Middle East. They quickly forgot their humble and modest beginnings, proudly wrapping themselves in incredibly expensive silk and stolen gold. Meanwhile, back in deeply impoverished Europe, countless heartbroken peasant widows continuously mourned the total loss of their husbands. The enormous, unimaginable wealth rapidly flowing back from Jerusalem only enriched the already incredibly powerful Catholic Church. It successfully financed the construction of towering, spectacular cathedrals, funded directly by the tragic sacrifices of the fallen. This incredibly dramatic and violent victory permanently and thoroughly altered the fragile political landscape of the entire medieval era. The massive Byzantine Empire, having foolishly requested assistance, now faced incredibly aggressive, heavily armed Christian foes. The initial, seemingly minor schism between the Eastern and Western Christian churches grew significantly and devastatingly wider and deeper. For the vast Islamic world, the sudden, deeply traumatic loss of Jerusalem was an absolute and profoundly devastating shock. It inevitably and undeniably paved the tragic way for the legendary Muslim commander Saladin to ultimately rise and seek fierce retribution. The immensely devastating and catastrophic cycle of holy warfare had officially begun, ensuring centuries of continuous, tragic bloodshed. History clearly and profoundly demonstrates that the true, ultimate victor of this grand crusade was neither the powerful church nor the people. It was the extremely dark, incredibly insatiable hunger for supreme power, masterfully disguised under the sacred holy veil of religion. When the sacred, divine word of Almighty God is continuously used to fiercely justify the tragic passing of truly innocent human beings, religion simply and undeniably ceases to be a profound path to salvation and violently becomes a catastrophic weapon of mass destruction. The tragic ghosts of those vanquished without mercy in Jerusalem still deeply haunt the dark, dusty pages of human memory today. Their completely silent, continuously echoing cries vividly serve as a grim, terrifying warning about the catastrophic dangers of blind fanaticism. The legendary crimson-stained swords of the medieval knights have long silently rusted into absolute and total nothingness in the desert. But the incredibly deep ideological scars they forcefully and violently carved remain vividly visible in the complex modern world around us. We must absolutely never forget the deeply terrifying consequences of masking our incredibly dark human ambitions with magnificent holy grace. The monumental First Crusade tragically left an enduring legacy of glorious holy victory, but at an unbelievably immense human cost. Was this horrific war a deeply tragic necessity of its turbulent time, or the absolute, undeniable, and ultimate corruption of pure faith? Tell us below. If you thoroughly enjoyed this spectacular and dark journey through history, please enthusiastically like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more epic